introduce James Ritchie and Bronwyn Smart. James and Bronwyn are both executive directors at Mindful Risk and offering audits, risk management, crisis management systems. In particular, today they're going to talk about practical assurance methodologies for MEM to adopt. So please welcome them to the party.
Thank you.
I'll just check the button. Perfect. Excellent. All right. I'll give them the instructions. All right. Good morning, everyone. Great to see most of you again. I think this is our third time we've presented in the last couple of years here. I don't know where that looks like it just disappeared again. I think we're just getting our AV up. But look, for those of you that haven't used a platform called Mentimeter before, it's really easy. When that comes back up in a sec, if you want to join along and join in the presentation, just scan the QR code with your phone and it'll bring you straight into the presentation. We'll just wait for this to come back up. Okay, excellent. So yeah, if you want to scan the QR code, you'll be able to interact with us all the way through. And you'll also be able to put all sorts of cute emojis, because I know you guys are all the cute emoji kind of people, particularly you, Craig Shales. I reckon you're pretty good. I can see James Pallas somewhere. I reckon he's pretty good for a cute emoji as well.
There we go.
Yeah, there we go. We're all up. Okay, great. Excellent. Let's get on with it then. So this is what we want to talk to you about today. We want to talk to you about practical assurance frameworks, and we want to offer a different model. And we like the touchy-feely side of risk management and safety, so we're going to take you through a model that might challenge you a bit in that regard. But just briefly, who are we? So look, we've been around since 2017. We're specialists in highly regulated sectors. Certainly my background was underground mining, Bronwyn's was banking. We started a firm because we thought we'd take two of Australia's least liked sectors and bring them together, just because that's what we like to do. We're all about helping build capability for organisations and people like yourselves. We love to help people identify their risk blind spots, and these days how we do it is through a mixture of traditional face-to-face consulting, but we also run online modulators, online content, online training systems and platforms, as well as Australasia's preeminent peer-to-peer risk management and work health and safety professional development network. So I know some of you, Jimmy, Craig and a few others, I think some Yancoal and Peabody guys are part of it, but if you'd like to know more about that, we'll be sending out some resources after the presentation. And ideally for yourselves, or if you've got risk and compliance or people and culture people in your organisation, we'd love to have them part of a conversation of, what are you up to now? About a couple of hundred members across Australasia of in-house general counsels, HR managers, WHS managers, risk and compliance managers, work health and safety managers. So that's our little spiel. Did I miss anything, Bron?
No.
Okay, good. Excellent. Okay, and just a quick interaction here. So everyone gets a bit worried these days. We're in a bit of a worrying time. You know, it's cost of living, it's interest rates, it's all that. We want to see how does your personal worry meter rank these risks? So for those that are on the platform with us, we'd love to see.
Put it on your phone.
Yeah, if you can just put in and rank it on your phone, that'd be awesome, and it'll start populating. Hopefully.
If it doesn't, we'll send the results.
Yeah,
out.
if it does, oh no, there we go. Now we're moving. All right, that's good. Look at it. We're away. Beautiful.
Oh no, cyber.
Yeah, so it's all moving
Cyber's
around.
making a late comeback.
It is. We should have taken some odds. There'd be some good odds on this, I think. And it's interesting, we work a lot with community-owned banking organisations, so, you know, mutuals, building societies. We run this exercise a lot, and it's really interesting to see that it changes quite distinctly depending on the industry you're in. So if you're a bank, it's pretty much people and cyber risk always sits at the top, maybe with fraud underneath. If you're a mining company, obviously the ESG stuff often creeps up.
And
crisis, yeah, absolutely. And then if you're someone else, then you probably don't even care, so no. All right, so it's interesting, people risk is the biggest issue for all of us in the room. It's always an interesting kind of straw poll just to understand where we're at. Okay, excellent. Thanks for that, guys. We'll move on. Okay, so the big thing today is we want to use the case study lens of the White Island incident in New Zealand to really frame up both what went wrong, what you can learn from it, and then we want to introduce a different model off the back of the learnings from that particular incident. So for that, I'll hand over to you, Bron.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah, do you want the...
No, you can drive.
Okay, all right, excellent.
I just need
Okay,
to
yep.
just make sure that I've got that right. So, yep, I'm figuring everyone can hear
Okay.
me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there we go. We'll get you an orange box next time.
I know,
Okay.
I need
Yep.
high heels. But anyway, so it was really interesting that crisis management ranked second highest on that little scale that we just took, because what we're talking about today is a crisis. And it's really interesting, so whilst not mining specific, definitely there are absolute learnings from this case study that we can all apply. All relates to that the PPRR model, I guess, for disaster management around planning and preparation, and then response and recovery from a crisis. We have done a case study on this, and I think we're sending it out to you all, distributing the actual case study post this discussion today, but we'll take you through it. If you can keep moving, that'd be great.
Okay, yeah, and learning outcomes, because this is an MOC specific presentation, so we want to take you through these failures and the case study. We want to apply some practical lessons learned, and we want to consider a new approach to drive assurance framework. So there you go, we've covered off the formalities.
Yep.
And Bron, did you want to do that before?
Okay, and with all of our case studies that involve real events, we always like to say that the Mindful Risk Group pays its respects to people that lost their lives at this event and people that continue to be impacted to this day. So a very brief summary of what actually happened during White Island, and it received international publicity and attention at the time, so I'm sure you're familiar with it. But it's very interesting what happened here because it relates to the tourism sector. So White Island is an active volcano in New Zealand, and there was actually 3 groups of tour companies that were on the island at the time. It was really interesting though in the lead up to this, if you remember sort of worldwide events, in New Zealand they'd had earthquakes in Christchurch, they'd had Pike River, they'd had the Christchurch Mosque terrorism event, and then we had White Island. So some really significant events in that decade for New Zealand. With White Island, people were touring. There was 47 people on the island at the time that were impacted by this. There was some very serious injuries for some. 22 people ultimately lost their lives. The emergency response that happened at the time was very chaotic, and this is one of the key learnings when it comes to a crisis, because it was a crisis for a community, it was a crisis across a supply chain of providers, and it was a crisis for the people that actually owned the island. I'll unpack that in a moment. But the prosecution that happened was the largest in New Zealand's history. So I'll just get you to flick over for me. But I just want to take a moment just to talk very briefly about New Zealand's regulatory environment, because their work health and safety legislation is very, very similar to Australia. They have an act, they have a regulation, they have PCBUs, they have officers, they have workers, they have the need to identify hazards and risks, exactly the same as what we've got here. And the regulator at the time investigated the incident but did not investigate the response, which I find really interesting. So they investigated what happened, they investigated the consultation, the shared duties, the officers' due diligence and all of those sorts of things, but didn't investigate the response. The response was very chaotic, and ultimately getting people off the island was actually left to commercial providers. So there was actually no government bodies that actually went and responded and got people off the island. The Coast Guard did send a boat from Whakatane, which was the closest land port to White Island, and in fact that's where all the tour boats left from. So there was a cruise ship from Australia that was over there, and they put out a day excursion. There were people who had just gone to Whakatane to go to participate in an excursion to go onto the island. And what was interesting is when the eruption happened, there was 3 tour companies on the island and 1 boat that had just left. And you've probably seen some of the footage of the eruption up close. The people on the boat that had just left took that footage. And then what happened was that boat went back. So that boat went back after the eruption to try and see if there was any survivors. As well, some commercial pilots flew helicopters from Whakatane over to get some survivors where they could and where they could land. There were 2 Westpac rescue helicopters dispatched from Auckland, and they were an hour out, and they were well equipped to deal with the response that was the medical response that was needed. But ultimately, authorities made a decision to put a no-fly zone over the island, and so the rescue helicopters couldn't land. So the only way that people were getting off that island in terms of emergency response was not a coordinated response from the government or emergency bodies at Whakatane. It was commercial providers that actually went and got people off.
And I think that's relevant when we think about mine sites in terms of imagine applying that to a major catastrophe at a mine site. You've got Westpac inbound with the care flight chopper, and a no-fly zone gets imposed on your area, and what that means for your overall emergency response. And I think we're going to come back to that a little bit later in the presentation.
And that quote there is actually a really fantastic quote that I think applies to a lot of things. So Phil Parkes, at the time, he was the CEO of the regulatory body there from WorkSafe, saying that it was unexpected, but it was not unforeseeable. And the fact that there was no planning, no preparation, no risk assessments, there's some key learnings here because the response was chaotic. It was ill-planned. There was actually nothing happening in terms of a coordinated response. Let's get a flick for me, thank you. So some of the critical failures, because this is the bit that we really want to focus on that we can all learn from here. There was actually no real investment in safety by a lot of the companies. So the people that owned the island, that was a company called Waikari Management Limited. They actually had approached GNS Science, a government body, to undertake a risk assessment on the island, but there was a cost of doing that risk assessment and they chose not to pay it. So there was no risk assessments going on. In fact, all of the providers that were taking tours onto that island, nobody had done a risk assessment. So there's actually no identification of risks and hazards going on. So there was, at the time, there had been elevated activity on the island, and this resulted in, the potential to level up for an eruption. In fact, the naming of how the crisis was happening, the scale was a move from level 1 to level 2, with level 3 being a full eruption. So on level 2, no one really knew what level 2 meant, but they knew there was increased activity. This still did not prompt anybody to go and do a risk assessment.
I was going to add there too, I think that made me think of TARPs in the mining sense. So it's like they really had a very arbitrary kind of crude version of a TARP in place, but then they chose not to follow it. So again, I think we're going to come back to that a little bit later as well.
Yeah. And there was really no safety information provided to the people participating in these tours. In fact, some of the survivors would say they got some safety information once they reached the island, but it was too late for them to make an informed decision about whether or not they'd go on the tour. So just assumed that all of these tour providers were managing their safety, which is probably a logical assumption. Like when we go and do things, we assume that safety's being managed, and that's what they did. They also weren't given a lot of information about appropriate PPE to wear. Certainly nobody was considering an eruption being imminent, even though there had been a regular series of eruptions taking place in the preceding years, about every 3 years. But these eruptions had been happening at a time where there's no people on the island. They were happening of a night time. So even though we had these kind of near misses going on, still nobody was thinking about what if one of those eruptions happened when there was people on the island. So there was also an absence of consultation and communication across all the PCBUs. So it was PCBUs that owned the island, that operated tours, that, all of these different bodies, and nobody talked to anybody else, which again made for a very chaotic response. They couldn't even account for who was actually on the island. There was no way of really knowing. who was on the island. There was certainly no emergency management plans, no response plans. There was no coordination around that, as I mentioned. And certainly anyone who was considered an officer, there was no due diligence going on, and that was an actual requirement under their legislation. But still, officers completely unaware of their due diligence obligations and no exercising of due diligence.
And I was just going to add with that, we've done some work in the last couple of years with the, let's call it the leisure management industry, which is what Dreamworld, all the major tour operators, theme parks, they're all part of this industry association. New Zealand's got this interesting approach in that sense that they've got this funky, what would you call it? It's almost like a state-funded public liability insurance scheme, which means that you get these proliferation in a way that you definitely get in very few other countries of these pretty wild adventure tour type operators. So, for example, you could never run an operation like that in Australia because of our legislative environment and our insurance environment. New Zealand, I think we heard at a recent conference, they're now sending people in wheelchairs off bungee jump platforms, and they can do that in a way that we'd never be able to. So just appreciating that it's a relatively loose environment from a legislative perspective, from a public liability perspective, but it's a very comparative environment from a work health and safety legislation perspective. Yep.
Okay. So I'll just get you to... Thank you.
Okay. And then so just the broad governance failures, we'll come back to this when we talk about the model, but the whole tone at the top. So, you know, what is the board and the senior leaders saying, and how is that interpreted at a worker level in terms of the people undertaking the tours? Most of the companies involved, and we will come back to this in a bit more detail, they literally did not conduct any sort of audit or assurance activities on anything. There was no documentation available to any of the members of the public or their staff. There was an absolute not my responsibility type of attitude in place, and that was, we're not alluding to that. That was certainly referred to in the judgment, which we'll go through shortly. And the big thing, which I think we want to come back to as well later, is this absolute absence of communication between entities, even during the emergency response.
Okay, so this is just a quote from the judge during sentencing, which really sort of encapsulates what had gone on here, was that there was, you know, no risk assessments going on, which was really fundamental to, as we know, identifying the hazards, putting your risk controls in place and all those sorts of things, you know. Really interesting from my sort of reading on this one. There was one risk control that they'd put in place, and that was to put a shipping container on the island. So someone had brought over a shipping container and plonked it onto White Island and said, you know, if anything goes on, happens, you know, we can use the shipping container. But it was poorly located, took way too long for anybody to get to it, and ultimately was proven during the eruption that it provided no protection at all. So just really poor attempts. And the fact that the owners of the island had approached you know, the geological government body to do a risk assessment and then decided not to proceed with it because there was a cost of it. And that's your tone at the top, the investment in your safety culture. And some of these things, rightly so, what the judge was saying during sentencing here. So some of the outcomes here. Biggest trial in New Zealand's history, 11-week trial, 13 parties charged. The island owners, the tour operators and the other tourism companies were all charged, so it was right across the supply chain, including 2 government agencies. So there was 2 government agencies that were charged as part of this. Half pled guilty, half went to trial. Directors were charged of the various companies for not meeting their due diligence requirements. It came very apparent that there was no risk controls in place or those that were effective. And in the end result was over $10 million just in reparations. That doesn't consider the fines that the companies had to pay and the costs of defending this thing. What was really interesting was that also some companies provided a little bit of safety documentation, but during the prosecution, the regulator came out and said whatever you had was completely ineffective. So it feels to me like a complete breakdown of all things workplace health and safety that we've come to know, but I feel like there's definitely things that we can learn from this event, but a very sad event as it was, and the biggest prosecution in New Zealand's history. And I'm sure you've all done your reading on it because it's, you know, was significant worldwide publicity.
Okay, so for us it was really, I know it might seem like a bit of a strange incident to link to mining, but for us it was an oldie but a goodie and a classic example of the whole tried and true reason Swiss cheese model lining up, that all these little latent and active failures lined up together to create an absolutely heinous tragedy.
And really it was a crisis. It was a crisis that community, that the government bodies, that the emergency responders, that everyone should have had a crisis plan in place, and yet nobody did. And the fact that they relied on commercial operators to get the people off the island is still, just befuddling.
And so I guess you could ask the question, why do we care about that as the mining or the resources sector? The things that we think are relevant to you guys in the room today are these 5 areas there. So absolutely, we know that the regulators put a lot of emphasis on quality in risk assessments of late in the resources sector, right down to trying to understand who's in the consultation group, trying to specifically link activities, risk events and risk controls in a very thorough fashion. We think this is an opportunity to reinforce to yourselves the need to have these rigorous risk assessments, and they need to be risk assessments that are both adaptable to changing environments, and you also need to have a mechanism in place to be able to pause, adapt and move them around, whether it be changing geological conditions, changing operational conditions. I think that's a really important reinforcing message. Secondly, the big thing, as Bronwyn's alluded to, is these people, they just didn't get the types of subject matter expertise around them that was needed. So I think the lesson for the industry is engaging the appropriate subject matter experts for the project, for the task that you're undertaking. I know at times from an operational perspective it can feel impossible to get the right people in the room, but I think there is a reminder there that getting the right people that actually know the task or the project that you're undertaking in terms of experts is critical to actually getting the best possible risk assessment outcome. Thirdly, emergency response, obviously that's a whole separate kind of presentation in of itself, but I think the one thing we wanted to highlight there is that whether it's a new project or whether it's bringing on a new piece of equipment or machinery that you haven't used before, we think it's important that you take the time to look at your EMP and to actually make sure that the specific failure scenarios that you might be exposed to as a result of this new project or this new piece of equipment are considered properly in your EMP, and that off the back of that, you've got a capacity to respond in the event of that scenario. Because I think we were talking earlier this week, going, how is it possible that you've got a tourism operator operating on an active volcano that hasn't considered the fact that the volcano might erupt as one of its risk issues? That was the kind of puzzling thing for us. But
and remembering what the regulator said at the time, it was unexpected, but not unforeseeable. You're on a volcanic island.
Yeah, and so we saw earlier this week that Queensland looks like it's now going to mandate critical controls in mining legislation. That really just emphasised the whole critical mandate for all of us as in the industry to put the focus on the critical controls and not just get lost in the generic sort of administrivia type controls that sometimes occurs. And then continuous improvement on your work health and safety obligations. So I know most of you being mine managers in the room, you probably constantly feel like the compliance benchmark is unachievably high. You've always got risk exposure. You've always got potential blind spots. You can never, whatever you do is never enough, that sort of feeling. It's also an important reminder to keep your professional development up around work health and safety, because you are statutory officials and you do have skin in the game, whether that be the recent psychosocial safety changes in the legislation, whether it be respect at work, all these sorts of things. That's a critical reminder. And then lastly, I know it's a bit of a cliche, but safety is an investment, not an overhead. So interestingly, having worked with, I think we counted it up the other day, so I think since 2017, I think it might have been you guys, Shalesy, was our first work health and safety review. We've done over 55 reviews across 7 different sectors over the last 7 years. Some of those consistent themes we won't go into today, but one of them is that the organisations that actually genuinely invest in safety, they do genuinely perform better at a productivity and a bottom line perspective. So safety is an investment, it's not a handbrake or an overhead. So that would be the last one in that. So we'll just let that sit for a second. 5, yep. Okay, what we want to offer here is an alternate approach. And so this might challenge some of you because we do like to look at things differently. I want to introduce this thing that we call the HECS framework. So an assurance framework that you're building, you've got most of us in the room, we're engineering, numbers, maths, logic sort of people, that's fine. What we want to introduce is an opportunity for you to think differently and approach assurance activities and frameworks differently from a personal perspective. So this isn't about you looking outwards, this is actually about you looking how you might change your approach. And it's an approach based on humility, inquiry, curiosity and self-reflection. It's like, here we go, next thing you know he's going to have us sitting cross-legged doing yoga, let's say.
But the approach is actually designed so that it allows you to then ask the right questions, to understand what's going on, to get the right answers. So this approach goes beyond the superficial level of asking of questions and actually gets what you would probably call to the root cause or underneath the issue that's presenting itself to allow you to understand what's actually going on.
So humility, it's a big one. Most of you in the room, you're probably your classic type A personality, like to be the boss in the room. This is hard, but this is actually what we've seen over the years, and this is how we'll reflect it to White Island. What we've seen work. So letting go of always needing to be the expert in the room, and instead, as we said, focusing your energy on getting the best possible subject matter experts around you for each situation. And I'm conscious of time, so I won't go too deep into it. Humble inquiry, that's what we're saying there. So ask, don't tell. So I think we're all guilty of that, and we do it pretty poorly generally as blokes. I'll speak only for us. I think asking more questions than you give instructions, even as a statutory official, can be a big challenge, but it can also lead you to getting better information from the people around you. Third, curiosity. So again, curiosity kills the cat, I guess, but no, adopt an attitude of curiosity. So that's genuine curiosity about what's going on around you, about the info. I think for the statutory people, whether you're VOs, whether you're engineering managers or mine managers, being curious but cynical about the information that people provide to you and going, if it doesn't feel right, I need to ask more questions, and being genuinely curious about human behaviour and information. And then lastly, self-reflection. Heard a great quote lately saying the difference between arrogance and confidence is the arrogant person says, I absolutely nailed that, whereas the confident person says, that was great, but what can we do better? And so I think that's the difference we're asking you to consider there. And I know it's a Tony Robbins cliche, but where focus goes, energy flows. So if you focus more on those four aspects, we've consistently seen organisations over the last 5 to 7 years that put energy into this, they get better outcomes in their assurance frameworks. And we're almost there. But ultimately, they also create a culture that doesn't always focus on a top-down approach. It does create an openly consultative environment. It creates knowledge seeking rather than this sort of didactic telling type space, and it genuinely supports psychological safety at work. Did you want to add anything on that? Because I know we're running.
No, it's all
Sure.
right.
Yep. Okay. And so ultimately, right, so we won't overblow you here, but if you think about, there's our airy-fairy framework, and you'll get this presentation in the deck anyway. But we think, okay, in a practical sense, what are the kinds of questions if you go, all right, well, what have we thought about with the White Island case study? What have you thought about with this framework? What kinds of questions should you be asking as you build assurance frameworks around you, or you just generally build assurance frameworks at a personal level as a statutory official? So what is the tone at the top? How effective is the consultation process we've got, particularly with our other PCBUs? Have our risk assessments recognised and minimised bias? Do we have the capability to review them in real time? Do we actually engage the right subject matter experts to understand the risks at a proper granular level? Do we have a process to review risk assessments and risk management processes on a scheduled basis? And have we actually really considered the pathways to failure in our EMP? And do we have capacity to respond in those scenarios?
So if you think about the scenario we've just given you with White Island, had anybody asked those types of questions, the outcome would have been very different.
And so just to wrap up there, I'll jump over that because I know we're out of time. just coming back to the summary, so we have considered and understood the active and latent failures. We've looked at applying some practical lessons, and we've considered a new model to drive assurance framework so you can avoid being the next White Island. And just lastly, we'll include this in the resources, so we've got a detailed discussion white paper that's gone into the Tourism Industry Association magazine. We'll give you guys that. We'd also like to include or encourage everyone to complete an imminent risk exposure scorecard that we've included. We've got a webinar in July that will be discussing effective crisis situations and management, so we'd love to invite everyone to that. And then also lastly, we've got an online course called Risk Management Fundamentals, and we'll be including details of how to access and complete that for free with the presentation deck. So I think we'll wrap it up at that.
Yeah, any questions?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, James and Bronwyn. It's a very mindful presentation, a lot of meat in that, and really application of a disaster that we all read and looked at the videos and thought how terrible, and to see it applied in this way is really good. And I really like the model of looking at people's and particular managers and how they approach safety at a really personal level. That I think's really interesting. Any questions? Quick question from the floor? Or we'll move on and keep moving. So thank you very much.
No worries, thank you. Okay, thank
You get one too, James. There you go. So thanks very much.
you. Thank you.
Super, great presentation. Okay, I'd like to introduce